The Age of Exploration was one of the most transformative periods in world history, marking the transition from medieval isolation to global interconnectedness. Spanning from the 15th to the 17th centuries, this era was driven by European nations seeking new trade routes, wealth, and territorial expansion. Portugal, under the leadership of visionary monarchs and navigators, became the pioneer in maritime exploration, establishing sea routes that reshaped global commerce. Among these explorers, Vasco da Gama stands out as a crucial figure, as his journey to India would forever alter the course of history. During the late Middle Ages, European economies were heavily reliant on trade with the East, particularly for valuable commodities such as spices, silk, and precious metals. However, the dominance of the Ottoman Empire overland trade routes made these goods prohibitively expensive for European buyers. In response, Portugal sought to bypass the land routes entirely by discovering a direct sea passage to India. This ambitious goal required not only advanced navigational techniques, but also significant financial and political commitment from the Portuguese monarchy. Prince Henry the Navigator played a crucial role in laying the groundwork for Portugal's exploration efforts. Although he never personally embarked on voyages, his investments in navigation schools, shipbuilding, and cartography created the necessary foundation for future discoveries. Under his guidance, Portuguese sailors ventured along the western coast of Africa, gradually mapping the region and establishing trading outposts. By the time Vasco da Gama was ready to embark on his historic journey, Portugal had already developed the expertise and maritime infrastructure needed for long-distance exploration. One of the most significant technological advancements of the period was the development of the caravel, a highly maneuverable ship that allowed for greater control in uncharted waters. These vessels, along with improved navigational instruments such as the astrolabe and quadrant, enabled Portuguese explorers to push beyond previously known boundaries. The ability to accurately determine latitude and adapt to changing wind patterns was essential for crossing the vast Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Religion also played a crucial role in motivating exploration. The spread of Christianity was often cited as one of the primary reasons for expanding into unknown territories. The Portuguese crown, in alignment with the Catholic Church, saw the discovery of new lands as an opportunity to convert non-Christian populations. Vasco da Gama's voyage, like many others of the time, was not only a commercial enterprise, but also a religious mission, intended to challenge the dominance of Muslim merchants in the Indian Ocean. Portugal's maritime success was also influenced by political stability and royal sponsorship. King Manuel I, who ascended the throne in 1495, was particularly eager to continue Portugal's expansionist policies. He saw the potential of controlling the spice trade as a means to elevate Portugal's status as a dominant European power. Thus, when Vasco da Gama was chosen to lead an expedition to India, he carried the weight of national ambition on his shoulders. Exploration, however, was not without its risks. The journey to India required sailors to navigate treacherous waters, endure extreme weather conditions, and survive for months without fresh supplies. Scurvy, dehydration, and unpredictable encounters with foreign civilizations posed constant threats. Many expeditions before Vasco da Gama's had ended in failure or had only achieved partial success. The fear of the unknown loomed over every voyage, making each successful return a remarkable feat. Beyond economic and religious motivations, the Age of Exploration had profound cultural and intellectual consequences. The encounters between European explorers and diverse civilizations led to an unprecedented exchange of knowledge, goods, and ideas. This period saw the beginning of globalization, as distant regions became increasingly connected through trade and diplomacy. Vasco da Gama's journey to India was not just a Portuguese endeavor. It was a landmark event that would shape international relations for centuries. Despite its many achievements, the Age of Exploration also had darker consequences. European expansion often led to the exploitation of indigenous peoples, the establishment of colonial rule, and the disruption of existing trade networks. The Portuguese presence in the Indian Ocean introduced new power struggles, as European forces competed with local rulers and merchants for control over valuable resources. Vasco da Gama's success in reaching India paved the way for future conquests, but it also marked the beginning of European dominance in the region, which would last for centuries. The Age of Exploration was a defining period in world history, driven by economic ambition, technological advancements, religious fervor, and political strategy. Portugal, as the leading maritime power of the time, played an essential role in opening new trade routes and expanding European influence. Vasco da Gama's voyage was a culmination of decades of preparation and determination, setting the stage for a new era of global commerce and empire building. His journey to India was not merely an isolated event, but a pivotal moment that signified the dawn of European overseas expansion. The success of Portugal's maritime expansion was not only the result of strategic planning and technological advancements, but also the courage and leadership of exceptional individuals. Among them, Vasco da Gama emerged as one of the most significant figures in the Age of Exploration. His early life, upbringing, and the political climate in which he was raised played a crucial role in shaping him into the navigator who would change the course of global history. Understanding Vasco da Gama's background helps contextualize the ambition, determination, and skills that allowed him to accomplish the first successful European voyage to India by sea. Vasco da Gama was born in Sines, Portugal, around 1460, into a noble family with strong ties to the maritime world. His father, Estevão da Gama, was a respected knight and held a position as a commander in the Order of Santiago, a military religious organization that played an influential role in Portugal's expansionist policies. Growing up in a coastal town, young Vasco was exposed to stories of exploration and naval conquests, which likely fueled his interest in the sea. His family's noble status provided him with access to education and training in navigation, mathematics, and astronomy, skills that were essential for an aspiring explorer. By the late 15th century, Portugal had already established itself as the leading maritime power in Europe, thanks to the efforts of Prince Henry the Navigator and later monarchs. Under King João II's rule, Portuguese explorers had successfully navigated along the western coast of Africa, seeking a sea route to India. Bartholomew Dias had reached the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, proving that it was possible to sail around Africa. However, the final link, crossing the Indian Ocean and establishing trade with India, had not yet been achieved. When King Manuel I ascended the throne in 1495, he was determined to complete this objective. Originally, Vasco da Gama's father, Estevão da Gama, had been chosen to lead the expedition to India, but his death led King Manuel I to appoint Vasco in his place. The decision was not made lightly. The voyage was of immense national importance, and failure could have significant economic and political consequences for Portugal. Vasco da Gama was selected for his experience, leadership skills, and proven loyalty to the crown. His background in naval and military affairs made him a strong candidate to lead what was expected to be a difficult and dangerous mission. The appointment of Vasco da Gama marked a turning point in Portugal's exploratory ambitions. Unlike previous expeditions that had focused on mapping and reconnaissance, this mission was designed to establish direct trade relations with the markets of India. The Portuguese crown aimed to challenge the Muslim-controlled trade networks that dominated the Indian Ocean and secure a steady supply of spices, particularly pepper and cinnamon, which were highly valued in Europe. The financial incentives for this journey were immense, as controlling the spice trade would grant Portugal unprecedented economic power. However, Vasco da Gama's task was far from simple. The journey required navigating uncharted waters, dealing with unpredictable weather conditions, and managing relations with foreign rulers whose cooperation was uncertain. Additionally, tensions with Muslim traders, who had long dominated trade in the Indian Ocean, posed a significant threat to Portuguese ambitions. The expedition required not only skill in navigation, but also diplomatic and military expertise to secure Portuguese interests abroad. Preparation for the voyage was extensive. King Manuel I ensured that Vasco da Gama was equipped with the best available resources. 4 ships were assigned to the expedition: the São Gabriel, the São Rafael, the Berrio, and a storage vessel. These ships were built with the latest navigational technology and fortified to withstand long journeys at sea. A crew of approximately 170 men, including experienced sailors, interpreters, and priests, was carefully selected to accompany the voyage. Supplies of food, water, and trade goods such as textiles, gold, and silver were loaded to facilitate exchanges with foreign merchants. Beyond the material preparations, Vasco da Gama also had to prepare for the political and religious implications of the mission. The Portuguese were entering a region where Muslim traders and Indian rulers had well-established networks and alliances. The presence of European ships in these waters could be met with hostility or suspicion. King Manuel I instructed Vasco da Gama to establish diplomatic relations wherever possible, but also to use force if necessary to protect Portuguese interests. This dual strategy of diplomacy and military readiness would later define Portugal's approach to empire building in the Indian Ocean. Despite the challenges ahead, Vasco da Gama's determination and ambition made him an ideal leader for the mission. He was known for his discipline, resilience, and ability to command loyalty from his men. His leadership would be tested in the coming years as he embarked on a journey that would take him farther than any European explorer had gone before. The success or failure of his expedition would determine Portugal's place in the global trading system and influence the course of world history. Vasco da Gama's rise was shaped by a combination of personal background, political ambition, and the broader context of Portuguese exploration. His appointment as the leader of the expedition to India was a testament to his skills and the trust placed in him by the Portuguese crown. As he prepared to set sail, he carried not only the hopes of his nation, but also the responsibility of transforming Portugal into a dominant global power. The journey ahead was filled with uncertainty, but its outcome would forever change the relationship between Europe and Asia, marking the beginning of a new era in global trade and empire building. The voyage that Vasco da Gama undertook in 1497 was one of the most significant maritime expeditions in history. It was the culmination of decades of Portuguese exploration and ambition, designed to establish direct trade with India and bypass the overland routes controlled by Muslim merchants. This journey was not only a test of human endurance and navigational skill, but also a turning point in global commerce. The successful completion of the voyage would establish Portugal as a dominant force in the spice trade and mark the beginning of European colonialism in the Indian Ocean. On July 8, 1497, Vasco da Gama set sail from Lisbon, commanding a fleet of 4 ships: the São Gabriel, the São Rafael, the Berrio, and a supply vessel. The fleet consisted of approximately 170 men, including sailors, navigators, soldiers, interpreters, and priests. The ships were equipped with advanced navigational instruments, including the astrolabe and quadrant, which enabled them to determine latitude at sea. The voyage was planned with precision, as failure to reach India would mean not only financial loss, but also a setback to Portugal's ambitions of maritime supremacy. The first phase of the journey followed the well-established route down the western coast of Africa. The fleet reached the Canary Islands and later Cape Verde, where they resupplied before heading into the open Atlantic. Unlike previous explorers who had hugged the African coast, Vasco da Gama employed a navigational technique known as the Volta do Mar, a strategy that involved sailing far into the Atlantic before turning back toward Africa to take advantage of favorable winds. This maneuver allowed the fleet to avoid the dangerous currents and wind patterns near the coast, ensuring a faster and safer passage. By November 1497, the fleet had rounded the Cape of Good Hope, the southernmost tip of Africa. This was a crucial milestone, as it confirmed that Portuguese ships could navigate around Africa to reach the Indian Ocean. The journey along Africa's eastern coast, however, presented new challenges. Unlike the uncharted waters of the Atlantic, the eastern coast of Africa was part of a well-established trade network controlled by Arab and Swahili merchants. These traders were often suspicious of foreign ships, viewing them as potential threats to their commercial interests. Vasco da Gama's first significant interaction with local populations occurred in Mozambique, where he attempted to establish friendly relations with the local sultan. Initially, the sultan welcomed the Portuguese, believing they were traders. However, tension soon arose when it became clear that da Gama lacked valuable goods for trade. The Portuguese were also seen as Christian outsiders in a region where Muslim traders had long dominated commerce. When relations soured, Vasco da Gama responded with force, bombarding the port before moving further north along the coast. This early conflict foreshadowed the violent confrontations that would define European interactions with the Indian Ocean world in the years to come. Further along the coast, the Portuguese stopped in Mombasa and Malindi, two rival city-states in present-day Kenya. While Mombasa proved hostile, Malindi welcomed the Portuguese, seeing them as potential allies against their regional competitors. It was in Malindi that Vasco da Gama secured the services of a skilled Arab navigator, believed to be Ahmad ibn Majid. This navigator possessed extensive knowledge of the monsoon wind patterns that controlled sailing routes in the Indian Ocean. With his guidance, the fleet set out across the ocean, finally reaching the shores of India in May 1498. The Portuguese arrival in Calicut, a major trading center on the southwestern coast of India, marked a historic moment. For centuries, Calicut had been a key hub in the spice trade, attracting merchants from across Asia and the Middle East. Vasco da Gama presented himself to the local ruler, known as the Zamarin, in the hopes of establishing a profitable trade agreement. However, he quickly encountered resistance. The local merchants, primarily Arab and Indian Muslims, were deeply entrenched in the trade network and had no interest in allowing Portuguese competition. Furthermore, the gifts that Vasco da Gama presented, textiles, hats, and glass beads, were considered unimpressive by Indian standards, further straining diplomatic efforts. Despite these setbacks, Vasco da Gama managed to negotiate limited trading rights before preparing for the return journey. However, the difficulties were far from over. The return trip to Portugal proved even more treacherous than the outbound journey. The fleet suffered from extreme shortages of food and water, and many crew members succumbed to scurvy, a disease caused by a lack of vitamin C. By the time the fleet reached Mozambique again, a significant portion of the crew had perished. Vasco da Gama was forced to burn one of his ships, the supply vessel, due to a shortage of manpower to operate it. After nearly 2 years at sea, the surviving ships finally reached Portugal in September 1499. Out of the original 170 men, less than half returned. Despite the heavy losses, the voyage was hailed as an extraordinary success. Vasco da Gama had achieved what no European before him had accomplished. He had established a direct sea route to India. The potential economic benefits of this discovery were immense, as Portugal now had access to the lucrative spice trade without relying on intermediaries. Vasco da Gama's first voyage was a milestone in the history of exploration, proving that it was possible to reach India by sea. While the journey was fraught with hardship, conflict, and loss of life, it set the foundation for future Portuguese expeditions and the eventual establishment of a colonial empire in the Indian Ocean. The voyage not only changed Portugal's fortunes, but also marked the beginning of European dominance in global trade, reshaping economic and political dynamics for centuries to come. The success of the expedition solidified Vasco da Gama's reputation as one of the greatest navigators of his time and ensured that Portugal would play a leading role in the new era of maritime expansion. The arrival of Vasco da Gama in India in May 1498 marked a turning point in global history. For the first time, a European power had successfully established a direct maritime link with the vast trading networks of the Indian Ocean. This achievement was not only a technical and navigational triumph, but also a moment of cultural, economic, and political confrontation. The Portuguese had arrived in a region with well-established commercial traditions, dominated by Arab and Indian merchants and controlled by powerful local rulers. Vasco da Gama's reception in Calicut was shaped by these existing structures and the way in which he presented himself to the local authorities. Calicut, located on the southwestern coast of India, was one of the most important trading centers in the Indian Ocean. Its ruler, known as the Zamarin, presided over a cosmopolitan city that attracted traders from across Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. Spices such as black pepper, cardamom, and cinnamon were the primary commodities, along with textiles and precious stones. Vasco da Gama and his crew arrived with high expectations, believing they could establish immediate and profitable trade relations. However, they quickly realized that the region's commercial system was far more complex than they had anticipated. Upon arrival, Vasco da Gama sought an audience with the Zamorin, presenting himself as an envoy of the Portuguese king, Manuel I. His objective was to secure a formal trade agreement that would allow Portugal to buy spices directly from Indian merchants. However, the gifts that the Portuguese brought, woolen cloth, hats, and trinkets, were perceived as unimpressive and of little value compared to the luxurious goods already available in Calicut. This miscalculation weakened da Gama's position in negotiations, as the local merchants saw little incentive to engage in trade with the newcomers. Moreover, the existing trade networks were already well integrated into the Indian Ocean economy. Arab and Muslim traders, who had controlled spice trade routes for centuries, viewed the Portuguese with suspicion. Vasco da Gama's presence threatened their monopoly, and they sought to undermine his efforts by advising the Zamorin against granting the Portuguese any special privileges. The Zamorin, while open to new trade opportunities, was not willing to alienate his long-standing commercial partners for the sake of an unknown European power. Despite these obstacles, Vasco da Gama was able to conduct limited trade before preparing for his return journey. He obtained a modest cargo of spices, but the trade conditions were not as favorable as he had hoped. The Portuguese were charged high prices, and they were not granted the exclusive trading rights that da Gama had envisioned. The failure to secure a stronger position in Calicut was an early indication that European success in the Indian Ocean would not come through peaceful trade alone, but would require military intervention and force. Tensions escalated further when Vasco da Gama attempted to leave Calicut. He had refused to pay the customary trading duties imposed by local authorities, believing that he was entitled to trade freely. This refusal angered the Zamorin's officials, who briefly detained some of the Portuguese as a form of leverage. Da Gama responded with aggression, taking hostages of his own and threatening violence. This initial conflict foreshadowed the confrontational and often brutal approach that the Portuguese would take in their future dealings with Indian Ocean powers. As Vasco da Gama prepared to depart, he left behind a small group of men to establish a Portuguese presence in Calicut. However, without sufficient military support, these men were vulnerable to attacks from rival traders and local forces. Their presence did not lead to an immediate strengthening of Portuguese influence, but instead exposed the challenges of maintaining a foothold in a foreign land without diplomatic leverage or military force. This realization would later influence Portugal's approach to establishing fortified trading posts and using naval power to dominate the region. The departure from India was just as difficult as the arrival. The return voyage proved to be one of the most arduous phases of the expedition. The Portuguese lacked adequate provisions, and many of the crew members suffered from scurvy and malnutrition. The harsh conditions of the Indian Ocean and the unpredictable monsoon winds made navigation difficult. By the time the fleet reached the eastern coast of Africa, a significant portion of the crew had perished. The first contact between the Portuguese and the Indian subcontinent was thus marked by a mixture of success and failure. While Vasco da Gama had achieved the historic feat of reaching India by sea, he had not secured the favorable trading conditions that King Manuel I had hoped for. The hostility from local merchants and rulers demonstrated that the Indian Ocean trade was not open to European newcomers without resistance. The Portuguese realized that economic dominance in the region would require not only diplomatic negotiations, but also military strength. Vasco da Gama's arrival in India was a pivotal moment that laid the foundation for future Portuguese expansion in the Indian Ocean. The first voyage demonstrated the potential for direct European involvement in the spice trade, but it also revealed the limitations of peaceful commerce. The resistance from local traders and rulers forced Portugal to reconsider its strategy, leading to a shift toward militarized trade and conquest in the coming decades. The initial meeting between Vasco da Gama and the Zamorin of Calicut was the beginning of a new era in global history, one that would shape the economic and political dynamics of the Indian Ocean for centuries to come. Vasco da Gama's return journey to Portugal was as challenging as his voyage to India. If reaching the shores of Calicut had been a triumph of navigation and endurance, The journey back tested the limits of human resilience. The hardships endured by da Gama and his crew not only underscored the perils of long-distance maritime travel, but also demonstrated the strategic and logistical difficulties of sustaining a European presence in the Indian Ocean. The losses suffered during the return voyage did not, however, diminish the significance of da Gama's achievement. Instead, his return to Portugal in 1499 was met with widespread celebration and marked the beginning of a new era for Portuguese exploration and expansion. The departure from India in August 1498 was fraught with difficulties. Unlike the well-calculated planning of the outbound journey, the return was hampered by unforeseen challenges. The monsoon winds, which had facilitated Vasco da Gama's crossing of the Indian Ocean earlier in the year, had now shifted, making navigation more treacherous. Lacking knowledge of these seasonal wind patterns, da Gama's fleet faced severe delays, leading to prolonged exposure to the harsh conditions of the open sea. The prolonged voyage resulted in severe food and water shortages, further worsening the already deteriorating health of the crew. The most devastating affliction suffered by the crew was scurvy, a disease caused by a deficiency of vitamin C, which was common among sailors on long voyages. The disease led to extreme fatigue, swollen gums, and eventual death. Since the nutritional importance of citrus fruits was not yet understood, there was no effective treatment for scurvy, and the crew's health rapidly declined. By the time the fleet reached the coast of Africa, dozens of men had died, and many others were too weak to perform their duties. The inability to sustain the voyage at full operational capacity forced da Gama to make difficult decisions. One of the most drastic measures taken was the abandonment of the largest supply ship, which had become a burden due to the lack of manpower. Burning the ship was a symbolic and strategic act. It lightened the fleet and allowed da Gama to focus on returning with his remaining vessels. However, even with this measure, the journey along the eastern coast of Africa proved to be arduous. At multiple stops along the Swahili coast, da Gama attempted to trade for supplies, but the hostility he had encountered on his journey to India persisted. Many local rulers, still wary of Portuguese intentions, refused to offer assistance. Upon rounding the Cape of Good Hope in early 1499, the Portuguese faced the final stretch of their voyage back to Lisbon. Although the worst of the journey was behind them, they continued to suffer losses. By the time the fleet reached the Azores, Vasco da Gama's brother, Paulo da Gama, who had been one of his closest companions throughout the expedition, was gravely ill. Da Gama made the decision to stay in the Azores with him, while the rest of the fleet continued to Portugal. Despite Vasco da Gama's efforts to nurse his brother back to health, Paulo succumbed to his illness before reaching Lisbon, marking a deeply personal loss for the navigator. The final return to Portugal in September 1499 was met with triumph. Although da Gama had lost a significant portion of his crew, he had successfully opened a sea route to India, proving that direct maritime trade between Europe and Asia was possible. Upon his arrival in Lisbon, King Manuel I honored him with a hero's welcome. The Portuguese crown recognized the enormous commercial and strategic potential of da Gama's discovery, and his expedition was hailed as one of the greatest achievements in Portugal's history. He was rewarded with the title Dom and granted substantial wealth and privileges. The implications of Vasco da Gama's journey were profound. His success signaled the beginning of a new phase of European expansion into the Indian Ocean, fundamentally altering the global balance of power. The Portuguese monarchy immediately began preparations for future expeditions to solidify their presence in India. They understood that securing trade routes would require not only diplomatic efforts, but also military force. The lessons learned from da Gama's voyage, including the difficulties of navigating the monsoon winds and the resistance from local merchants, would shape Portugal's approach to empire building in the coming decades. Additionally, the return of Vasco da Gama's fleet with a cargo of spices demonstrated the immense profitability of direct trade with India. The spices brought back to Portugal, primarily pepper and cinnamon, were sold at exorbitant prices, proving that the new trade route had the potential to make Portugal one of the wealthiest nations in Europe. This realization spurred King Manuel I to accelerate efforts to establish a permanent Portuguese presence in the region. leading to the dispatch of a much larger and better-armed fleet under Pedro Alvarez Cabral in 1500. Despite his success, Vasco da Gama's first voyage also exposed the challenges and conflicts that would define Portuguese interactions with the Indian Ocean world. The hostility encountered in Calicut and along the Swahili coast foreshadowed the military confrontations that would soon follow. Portugal's trade ambitions were not welcomed by the established Muslim and Hindu merchants who had long dominated commerce in the region. Future Portuguese expeditions would increasingly rely on naval superiority and military aggression to impose their dominance over these trade networks. Vasco da Gama's return to Portugal marked both the triumph of his historic journey and the beginning of an era of European maritime expansion. His voyage demonstrated the feasibility of direct trade with India, but it also highlighted the difficulties of integrating into existing trade networks without conflict. The knowledge gained from this expedition laid the foundation for Portugal's aggressive expansion into the Indian Ocean, setting the stage for a period of colonial competition and economic transformation. Though his journey was fraught with hardship and loss, da Gama had succeeded in forever altering the course of world history. Following Vasco da Gama's historic voyage, Portugal swiftly recognized the potential of the newly discovered sea route to India. The economic, political, and strategic implications of direct access to the spice trade were too great to ignore. However, as da Gama's first expedition had demonstrated, trade in the Indian Ocean was already dominated by powerful and well-established Muslim and Hindu merchants. It became clear that Portugal would have to rely not only on commerce, but also on military force to secure a lasting foothold in the region. Over the next few decades, the Portuguese crown implemented an aggressive expansion policy, leading to the establishment of fortified trading posts and the imposition of naval dominance over the Indian Ocean. The first significant step toward consolidating Portuguese power in India came with the second expedition to India in 1500, led by Pedro Alvarez Cabral. Unlike da Gama's small exploratory fleet, Cabral's expedition was a heavily armed flotilla of 13 ships, carrying over 1,000 men, including soldiers and merchants. This mission had clear objectives: to establish diplomatic and trade relations with Indian rulers, secure a monopoly over the spice trade, and assert Portuguese military power in the region. However, the journey was fraught with conflict, setting a precedent for the violent confrontations that would characterize Portuguese expansion. Upon reaching Calicut, Cabral initially attempted to negotiate with the Zamorin, the same ruler whom Vasco da Gama had met. The Portuguese sought more favorable trading terms and the establishment of a permanent trading post. However, tensions quickly escalated when Arab and Indian merchants, who viewed the Portuguese as a threat to their commercial dominance, incited hostility against them. The situation reached a boiling point when a violent attack on the Portuguese factory, trading post, resulted in the deaths of several Portuguese merchants. In response, Cabral retaliated with a brutal naval bombardment of Calicut, destroying parts of the city and killing hundreds. This act of aggression marked the beginning of open hostilities between Portugal and the established Indian Ocean trading powers. Realizing that Calicut was no longer a viable trading partner, Cabral turned to the rival kingdom of Cochin, a smaller but strategically located port further south. The Raja of Cochin, eager to weaken Calicut's dominance, welcomed the Portuguese and granted them trading privileges. This marked the first significant Portuguese alliance in India, laying the groundwork for future expansion. The Portuguese established a fortified trading post in Cochin, ensuring a steady supply of spices and setting a model for their future settlements. The shift in strategy, from peaceful trade negotiations to military confrontation and strategic alliances, was further reinforced by the arrival of Vasco da Gama's second voyage in 1502. This time, da Gama commanded a heavily armed fleet, sent not just to trade, but to establish Portuguese naval supremacy in the Indian Ocean. Unlike his first voyage, where he had sought diplomatic recognition, this expedition was characterized by open warfare against those who opposed Portuguese dominance. One of the most notorious incidents of this expedition was the massacre of the Miri, an Arab merchant ship carrying hundreds of men, women, and children. Vasco da Gama, determined to send a message to rival traders, ordered the ship to be set on fire, killing nearly everyone on board. This act of ruthless violence demonstrated the shift in Portuguese policy, from being mere participants in the trade network to becoming enforcers of a new maritime order based on military superiority. Such tactics, though brutal, were effective in intimidating local rulers and consolidating Portuguese control. By 1505, King Manuel I appointed Francisco de Almeida as the first viceroy of Portuguese India, further solidifying Portugal's long-term commitment to the region. Almeida's main task was to secure Portugal's dominance over key trading routes by building a network of fortified settlements along the coast of India, Africa, and the Persian Gulf. Under his leadership, the Portuguese established strongholds in Cochin, Cananor, and Goa, creating a chain of military and commercial outposts that would allow them to control trade and impose taxes on rival merchants. One of Almeida's most significant military victories came in 1509, when the Portuguese decisively defeated a coalition of Arab, Egyptian, and Indian forces at the Battle of Gio. This naval battle, fought off the coast of Gujarat, marked the end of Mamluk and Arab naval dominance in the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese, using their superior firepower and naval tactics, crushed the opposing fleet, thereby securing their control over the critical trade routes between India and the Middle East. This victory established Portugal as the dominant maritime power in the Indian Ocean for decades to come. However, the Portuguese ambitions were not limited to India. Their expansion extended to the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and Southeast Asia, where they sought to control key choke points such as the Strait of Hormuz and the Strait of Malacca. These strategic locations allowed Portugal to regulate the flow of spices and other valuable goods, effectively turning the Indian Ocean into a Portuguese-controlled trading zone. This aggressive expansionist policy, while profitable for Portugal, led to continuous conflicts with local rulers, Arab traders, and eventually other European powers. The years following Vasco da Gama's first voyage saw Portugal transition from an exploratory power to an empire builder in the Indian Ocean. The failure to integrate peacefully into the existing trade networks led the Portuguese to adopt a militarized approach, using force to secure their dominance. The establishment of fortified trading posts, the strategic use of alliances, and the destruction of rival fleets ensured Portugal's control over the spice trade for much of the 16th century. However, this aggressive expansion came at a cost: resistance from local powers, increasing reliance on violence, and the eventual challenge from other European nations. Vasco da Gama's pioneering journey had opened the door, but the empire that followed was built on conquest and conflict. As Portugal consolidated its power in the Indian Ocean, Vasco da Gama's role in shaping this new maritime empire was not yet over. After his groundbreaking voyages in 1497 to 1499 and 1502 to 1503, da Gama spent nearly 2 decades away from India, remaining a powerful figure in Portugal. However, in 1524, at the age of approximately 64, he was called upon once more by King John III to return to India, this time not as an explorer or military commander, but as the Viceroy of Portuguese India. This final voyage would solidify his place in history, not only as the pioneer of the sea route to India, but also as one of the key architects of Portugal's growing empire. By the time of da Gama's appointment, Portuguese power in India was at a crossroads. The initial dominance established by Francisco de Almeida and Afonso de Albuquerque had begun to weaken due to corruption, inefficiency, and growing resistance from local rulers and rival traders. The Portuguese administration, centered in Goa, was plagued by internal conflicts among officials, many of whom sought personal enrichment over the stability of the empire. The Portuguese king saw Vasco da Gama, an experienced leader with a reputation for discipline and severity, as the ideal figure to restore order and reassert Lisbon's authority over its Indian territories. Vasco da Gama's third and final voyage to India in 1524 differed significantly from his previous expeditions. This was no longer a journey of discovery or conquest, but a mission of governance. As viceroy, da Gama's primary goal was to reform the administration and eliminate corruption, ensuring that the Portuguese strongholds in India remained efficient and profitable. His return, however, was not met with universal approval. Many Portuguese officials stationed in India viewed him as an outsider who threatened their influence. and resistance to his authority emerged even before he reached Goa. Despite these challenges, da Gama took immediate steps to reassert control. He implemented strict measures to curb corruption among Portuguese officials, replacing those he suspected of mismanagement with trusted allies. He also sought to strengthen Portuguese military and naval power in the region, recognizing that continued dominance in the spice trade required both diplomatic and military superiority. His efforts were particularly focused on securing Portuguese alliances with local rulers who were willing to cooperate in exchange for protection against their rivals. However, Vasco da Gama's tenure as viceroy was tragically short-lived. Shortly after arriving in India, he fell seriously ill, likely due to the harsh tropical climate and the physical toll of his journey at an advanced age. Despite his illness, he continued to oversee administrative reforms, but his condition rapidly deteriorated. By December 1524, just a few months after taking office, Vasco da Gama succumbed to his illness in Cochin. His death marked the end of an era. He had lived to see the transformation of Portuguese exploration into a full-fledged maritime empire, but he would not witness its long-term consequences. Initially buried in St. Francis Church in Cochin, da Gama's remains were later transported back to Portugal in 1539, where they were reinterred in a grand tomb in the Jerónimos Monastery in Lisbon. This final resting place was a testament to his status as one of Portugal's greatest national heroes, his legacy forever linked to the age of exploration and the rise of the Portuguese Empire. The impact of Vasco da Gama's voyages extended far beyond his lifetime. His discovery of the sea route to India had not only revolutionized global trade, but also set the stage for European imperialism in Asia. The Portuguese established a maritime empire that stretched from the coasts of Africa to the Spice Islands, controlling key trade routes and monopolizing the flow of valuable goods such as spices, silk, and gold. The model of fortified trading posts that he helped pioneer would later be replicated by other European powers, including the Dutch, the British, and the French. Despite his achievements, da Gama's legacy remains controversial. While he is celebrated as a brilliant navigator and a key figure in the history of exploration, his expeditions were also marked by extreme violence and ruthless tactics. His destruction of rival ships, execution of prisoners, and aggressive imposition of Portuguese power reflect the darker side of European expansion. Many historians argue that his voyages, while opening new commercial opportunities, also paved the way for centuries of colonial exploitation and conflict. From a Portuguese perspective, da Gama's success secured the nation's position as a dominant global power in the 16th century. The immense wealth generated by the spice trade helped finance the expansion of Portuguese influence, leading to the creation of an empire that would endure for centuries. His navigational feats also inspired future generations of explorers, reinforcing Portugal's reputation as the world's leading maritime nation during the Age of Discovery. Vasco da Gama's final voyage to India was both the culmination of his life's work and a symbol of the changing nature of Portuguese involvement in the Indian Ocean. No longer an explorer, he returned as a governor, tasked with managing an empire that had grown out of his initial journey in 1498. His death in Cochin marked the end of one of the most consequential lives in maritime history. Though his direct influence ended, the legacy of his voyages shaped global trade, geopolitics, and colonial expansion for centuries to come. The sea route he pioneered remained a vital artery of commerce, linking Europe and Asia in an era of unprecedented global interaction, one that would define the modern world. The voyages of Vasco da Gama were not merely a triumph of navigation and exploration. They fundamentally reshaped the global trade system and set the stage for centuries of European dominance in the Indian Ocean. His discovery of a direct sea route between Europe and Asia broke the long-standing control that Middle Eastern and Mediterranean powers had over the lucrative spice trade. The consequences of this shift extended beyond commerce, influencing the rise and fall of empires, the spread of European influence, and the political and economic structures of Asia, Africa, and Europe. Before da Gama's voyages, trade between Europe and Asia had been monopolized by the Venetians and the Ottoman Empire, who controlled overland trade routes through the Middle East. Spices, silk, and precious metals from India and China had to pass through multiple intermediaries, significantly increasing their cost by the time they reached European markets. The Portuguese, by finding a direct sea route, bypassed these intermediaries and secured a monopoly over the spice trade, drastically reducing prices and increasing profits. This economic advantage allowed Portugal to become one of the wealthiest nations in Europe during the 16th century. The shift in trade routes also had profound effects on the Middle East and North Africa. The decline of overland trade weakened the economies of cities such as Cairo, Baghdad, and Constantinople, which had long depended on the transit of goods between Asia and Europe. The Ottoman Empire, recognizing the threat posed by Portuguese control of the Indian Ocean, attempted to counter their expansion by engaging in naval battles, particularly in the Red Sea and Persian Gulf. However, the superior firepower and naval technology of the Portuguese allowed them to maintain control over the sea lanes, securing dominance over trade routes that had been in place for centuries. One of the most significant long-term consequences of da Gama's discovery was the European colonial presence in Asia. While the Portuguese were the first to establish a maritime empire in the Indian Ocean, their success encouraged other European nations, most notably the Dutch, British, and French, to challenge their dominance. The Portuguese model of controlling trade through fortified settlements was later replicated by the Dutch in Indonesia, the British in India, and the French in Southeast Asia. The result was a centuries-long European presence in Asian markets, leading to colonial rule and imperial expansion. In Africa, da Gama's voyages had similarly profound effects. The Portuguese established a series of coastal forts and trading posts along the West and East African coasts, including key locations in Mozambique, Mombasa, and Angola. These settlements were primarily used as supply stations for ships traveling to and from India, but they also became centers of trade for gold, ivory, and, tragically, enslaved people. The expansion of the transatlantic slave trade in the following centuries was in part facilitated by Portugal's growing presence in Africa, a legacy that would have devastating human consequences. Da Gama's discovery also reshaped the maritime balance of power. For centuries, the Indian Ocean had been a relatively open and cooperative trading environment, where merchants from India, the Middle East, East Africa, and Southeast Asia conducted business without centralized control. The arrival of the Portuguese changed this dynamic, as they introduced a system of naval dominance based on force, taxation, and exclusion of competitors. The Portuguese implemented the Cartaz system, a system of naval passes that forced merchants to obtain Portuguese licenses to trade freely in the Indian Ocean. Those who refused were often attacked or had their cargo confiscated. This aggressive strategy fundamentally altered the structure of global trade and marked the beginning of European economic hegemony in Asia. Another crucial effect of da Gama's voyages was the cultural exchange between Europe and Asia. While much of this exchange was driven by trade, it also involved the spread of religion, technology, and ideas. Portuguese missionaries, particularly the Jesuits, followed in the wake of explorers and sought to convert local populations to Christianity. In some regions, such as Goa, Christianity took root and remains a significant religious presence today. The Portuguese also introduced new military technologies, shipbuilding techniques, and European customs to the Indian Ocean world, while simultaneously bringing Asian goods, artistic influences, and culinary traditions back to Europe. The increased interaction between Europe and Asia also had unintended consequences, particularly in the form of conflicts and resistance movements. Local rulers and merchants did not passively accept Portuguese dominance. The Zamarin of Calicut, the Sultan of Gujarat, and the Mamluks of Egypt all launched repeated efforts to expel the Portuguese, leading to numerous naval battles and sieges. Even within Portuguese-controlled territories, local populations frequently rebelled against foreign rule, foreshadowing the eventual decline of Portuguese power in the region. Despite its aggressive expansion, Portugal's hold over the Indian Ocean trade routes was not permanent. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, Dutch and British naval forces began challenging Portuguese dominance. The Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company gradually took over Portuguese strongholds, using more efficient economic and military strategies. The Portuguese Empire, which had once dominated global trade, began to decline, although its influence remained significant in certain regions like Goa, Macau, and Mozambique for centuries. Vasco da Gama's voyages had far-reaching consequences that shaped the course of global history. By establishing a direct sea route between Europe and Asia, he not only revolutionized trade, but also laid the foundation for European colonialism in the Indian Ocean. The effects of his discovery extended beyond economic prosperity for Portugal, leading to shifts in political power, military conflicts, and cultural exchanges that would define global interactions for centuries. While he is celebrated as a pioneering navigator, his legacy is also intertwined with the darker aspects of imperialism and exploitation. The world he helped to create was one of opportunity and conquest, cooperation and conflict, a world forever altered by the journey he first undertook in 1497. Despite the monumental success of Vasco da Gama's voyages and the initial dominance of Portugal in the Indian Ocean, the empire he helped establish did not remain unchallenged. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, Portugal's control over the region began to weaken due to a combination of external pressures, internal instability, and the growing competition from rival European powers. The decline of Portuguese influence in the Indian Ocean was not sudden, but rather a gradual process marked by military defeats, economic challenges, and shifting geopolitical dynamics. One of the key reasons for Portugal's decline was the emergence of stronger European competitors, particularly the Dutch and the British. By the early 1600s, both nations had developed formidable navies and more efficient economic models for overseas expansion. Unlike the Portuguese, who relied heavily on state-sponsored expeditions, the Dutch and the British created private trading companies. The Dutch East India Company, VOC, and the British East India Company, EIC. These organizations had greater financial resources, better logistical management, and the ability to sustain long-term operations in the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese also faced military setbacks that weakened their strategic positions. One of the most significant defeats came at the hands of the Dutch at the Battle of Malacca in 1641, where Portugal lost control of a crucial trading post that connected the Indian Ocean trade with Southeast Asia and China. Similarly, in 1612, the British defeated the Portuguese at the Battle of Swally, securing a foothold in India and signaling the beginning of Portuguese decline in the subcontinent. These defeats illustrated Portugal's inability to maintain its earlier naval supremacy. Another factor in Portugal's weakening grip over the Indian Ocean was its overextension and lack of resources. Unlike larger European powers such as Spain, France, and Britain, Portugal was a relatively small nation with a limited population and financial capacity. Maintaining a vast network of fortified trading posts across Africa, the Middle East, India, and Southeast Asia required significant resources, both in terms of military manpower and economic investment. As other European nations grew wealthier and more powerful, Portugal struggled to sustain its empire. The decline of Portuguese dominance was further exacerbated by internal political instability. In 1580, Portugal was absorbed into the Iberian Union under Spanish rule after the death of King Henry I of Portugal, who left no heir. For 60 years, Portugal was ruled by the Spanish crown, which prioritized its own global conflicts, particularly with the Dutch and the English, over the protection of Portuguese interests in the Indian Ocean. During this period, Portugal's neglected colonies became vulnerable to attacks from European rivals, further accelerating its decline. Local resistance also played a crucial role in diminishing Portuguese control over key territories. While Vasco da Gama and his successors had initially imposed dominance through force, the Indian and Arab merchants, along with regional rulers, never fully accepted Portuguese rule. In the 16th and 17th centuries, various local uprisings weakened Portuguese influence. In 1656, the Sultan of Oman expelled the Portuguese from Muscat, and by 1698, Mombasa had also freed itself from Portuguese control. These rebellions demonstrated that despite Portuguese military efforts, their rule was never secure in the Indian Ocean. Another major issue contributing to Portuguese decline was the economic transformation of global trade. The once profitable spice trade was no longer as lucrative as it had been in Vasco da Gama's time. As European economies diversified, new trade goods, such as textiles from India and silver from the Americas, became more important. Additionally, the Portuguese had failed to develop sustainable economic policies, relying too heavily on monopolies and taxation rather than fostering open trade networks. The Dutch and British, by contrast, used their economic strength and diplomatic strategies to establish long-lasting commercial relationships in Asia. Religious tensions also played a role in Portugal's downfall. The aggressive spread of Christianity by Portuguese missionaries, particularly the Jesuits, created deep-seated resentment among local Muslim and Hindu populations. Unlike the Dutch and British, who were more focused on trade and governance, the Portuguese sought to convert local populations, often leading to conflicts and resistance. In regions like Goa, Christianity took root, but in many other areas, the forced religious conversions fueled hostility against Portuguese rule. By the early 18th century, Portugal had lost most of its strategic holdings in the Indian Ocean. Goa, Gio, and Daman remained under Portuguese control, but they were isolated and largely insignificant compared to the powerful British and Dutch territories. The once mighty Portuguese Empire in Asia had shrunk to a fraction of its former size, surviving only in small enclaves. While Vasco da Gama's voyages had opened the door for Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean, that dominance was ultimately unsustainable. The rise of stronger European competitors, Portugal's limited resources, military defeats, local resistance, and economic changes all contributed to its decline. The Portuguese had initiated European colonialism in Asia, but they were soon replaced by the more powerful British and Dutch. Although Portugal maintained a minor presence in India until 1961, its influence as a global maritime power had long since faded. The legacy of Vasco da Gama remained, but the empire he helped build had given way to a new era of European imperialism, one that would be defined by more powerful and organized colonial systems. The legacy of Vasco da Gama, one of the most significant figures of the age of exploration, extends far beyond the boundaries of his time. His pioneering voyages to India not only transformed the course of history, but also set in motion a series of events that would alter the geopolitical, economic, and cultural landscapes of the modern world. Although the Portuguese Empire eventually declined, the changes initiated by da Gama's voyages had long-lasting effects that continue to shape global interactions to this day. At the most fundamental level, da Gama's discovery of the sea route to India opened up global trade in a way that was previously unimaginable. His voyages heralded the beginning of the globalization of commerce, where goods, services, and capital could flow across oceans, transcending national borders. The Portuguese were the first to exploit maritime trade to its fullest extent, establishing key port cities and trade routes that later became integral parts of the global economic system. These trade networks created the foundation for a world where intercontinental trade became not just feasible, but increasingly important. While Vasco da Gama's era witnessed the initial dominance of Portuguese maritime power, the broader impact of his voyages was far-reaching. The rise of colonial empires, both Portuguese and eventually others like the British, Dutch, and French, transformed the political and economic realities of the world. These empires controlled vast swaths of land and trade routes, their influence touching nearly every corner of the globe. The age of imperialism, which began with Portugal's expansion, would go on to shape international relations, resource extraction, and global politics for centuries. The economic rivalry between European powers that ensued would lead to a world where the distribution of wealth and power was concentrated in Europe, with far-reaching consequences for colonized societies. Moreover, Vasco da Gama's voyages exemplify the beginnings of modern European imperialism. While his initial intent was to secure Portugal's place in the lucrative spice trade, his successful route to India paved the way for later European nations to pursue imperial ambitions across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. His legacy as a maritime pioneer, thus, intertwines with the larger colonial enterprise that dominated the world for the next several centuries. This imperialism brought both advancements, such as infrastructure and technological exchange, but also exploitation, as indigenous populations were often displaced or subjugated by colonial powers. On a more local level, Vasco da Gama's presence in the Indian Ocean left a lasting imprint on the cultures and societies of the regions he encountered. The Portuguese did not only bring economic goods, but they also brought their religion, language, and customs. Christianity, particularly through the work of Jesuit missionaries, found a permanent foothold in parts of India, China, and Southeast Asia, with the legacy of Portuguese Catholicism still visible today in regions like Goa, which remains a unique blend of Portuguese and Indian cultural influences. Additionally, the Portuguese contributed to the spread of European culture in Asia, whether through architecture, art, or language. The interaction between these diverse cultures would contribute to the richness of Asia's cultural heritage, even as it led to tensions between European settlers and local populations. However, the legacy of Vasco da Gama also comes with darker consequences. Colonialism, exploitation, and the transatlantic slave trade were all byproducts of the system set in motion by da Gama's voyages. The Portuguese establishment of fortified ports and trade monopolies in Africa and Asia was a precursor to the exploitation of natural resources and the forced labor that became synonymous with European colonization. In Africa, Portuguese traders were instrumental in the development of the slave trade, which would have devastating consequences for millions of Africans and shape the social, political, and economic structures of the New World. The lasting scars of this exploitation continue to affect global relationships today. Economically, the shift initiated by Vasco da Gama and his successors toward global markets and the growing prominence of capitalist trade systems helped lay the foundation for the modern global economy. The influence of European colonial powers on trade, resource extraction, and industrialization led to the development of an interconnected world economy. The economic expansion that began with Portuguese control over the spice trade eventually led to the rise of other industries, such as textiles and rubber, and created trade hubs that spanned from the Americas to the Far East. By establishing the frameworks for modern commerce and exchange, Vasco da Gama indirectly facilitated the rise of global capitalism, which continues to define economic systems today. On the political front, Vasco da Gama's voyages also marked the emergence of nation-states as dominant political entities. The quest for overseas territories and trade routes spurred the development of more centralized states, as monarchies sought to finance and control expeditions. The rise of powerful colonial empires created a geopolitical landscape that shifted from feudal or regional power structures to centralized nation-states with global ambitions. This change fundamentally altered the structure of international relations and diplomacy, laying the groundwork for the modern system of states and the international institutions that would eventually emerge in the 20th century. The environmental impact of Vasco da Gama's voyages, while not immediately apparent at the time, has also had lasting effects. The global trade that followed in his wake contributed to the movement of species, technologies, and materials around the world in ways that have had both positive and negative consequences. The Columbian Exchange, for example, was the widespread transfer of crops, animals, and diseases between the Americas, Europe, and Africa. These exchanges would reshape diets, agriculture, and ecology globally, but they would also facilitate the spread of diseases that would decimate indigenous populations in the Americas. In the modern world, Vasco da Gama is often seen as a symbol of human curiosity and ambition, a man whose determination and exploration of the unknown exemplify the spirit of discovery that has driven much of human progress. His voyages represented a shift in how humanity understood the world, an understanding that increasingly embraced exploration, knowledge, and technological advancement. His legacy is celebrated in Portugal and throughout the world, where he is remembered not just as an explorer, but as an emblem of the age of discovery. In conclusion, Vasco da Gama's influence extends far beyond the historical context in which he lived. His voyages did more than just open a sea route to India. They set the stage for centuries of imperialism, economic change, and cultural interaction. The legacy of his actions continues to resonate in modern global trade, politics, and cultural exchanges, reminding us of both the possibilities and the pitfalls of exploration. While his achievements are celebrated, the more problematic aspects of his legacy, colonialism, exploitation, and the forced integration of disparate cultures, must also be acknowledged. Da Gama's story, in the end, encapsulates the complex and often contradictory forces that have shaped the modern world.